How's it going, everyone? Mr. Leva here again with another video lecture. This is going to be over the essential question: how can we use narrative poetry to develop a theme? And our topic for today is going to be narrative poetry. We're going to start off by taking a step back from narrative poetry itself and looking just at narratives in general. We're going to do that by looking at some of the common elements that we find in different narratives. Now, we're not going to cover everything. We're just going to go over the basics right now, just so we have a foundation that we can actually start talking about these poems with. Now, you will be taking notes throughout this entire thing, so my suggestion is make sure that you're looking at the headings to make sure that you're not missing anything, okay? We're going to start off with this first thing that we're going to call plot. Now, plot has 5 different parts: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. We can represent plot using this little diagram that you see off to the right here. We start off with this flat line. We can write exposition on it. Then we have our rising action going up from there. The rising action goes up to this turning point at the top. It's like a little peak. That's our climax. Then we come back down from there with our falling action, and we finally end up leveling off with our resolution. Let's go ahead and look at each of these 5 parts independently. We're going to start off again with exposition. The exposition is the portion of a story that introduces important background information to the audience. For example, information about the setting, events occurring before the main plot, characters' backstories, etc. Our rising action: the central part of the story during which various problems arise after a conflict is introduced. So essentially we set up everything with the exposition. After that we introduce conflicts, and then things start to happen, and that's what we call our rising action. Then we have our climax. The climax is the turning point which changes the protagonist's fate. Now, by protagonist I mean the main character. Now, how this usually ends up is, if it's a comedy, before the climax things are kind of going bad for the protagonist, and then we have our turning point where things start to come together. For a tragedy, it starts off with everything good, and then at the climax or big turning point, things start to go horribly wrong for them. So that's why we have this climax come into play with the conflicts that we see in the story. After that, we have, of course, our falling action. During the falling action, the conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist unravels, with the protagonist winning or losing against the antagonist. The falling action may contain a moment of final suspense, in which the final outcome of the conflict is in doubt. After the falling action, we have our resolution. The resolution, or denouement as it's sometimes called, is the part of the story in which the problems are resolved and the action comes to a satisfying end. The comedy ends with a denouement in which the protagonist is better off than at the beginning of the narrative. The tragedy ends with a catastrophe, in which the protagonist is worse off than at the beginning of the narrative. And that's going to wrap it up for the plot portion. So let's go ahead and move on to our next little element. That's going to be setting. In literature, the word setting is used to identify and establish the time, place, and mood of the events of the story. It basically helps in establishing where and when and under what circumstances the story is taking place. Then we have characterization. Characterization in literature refers to the step-by-step process wherein the author introduces and then describes a character. The character can be described directly by the author or indirectly through the actions, thoughts, and speech of the character. Now, how you can think about this is, directly is whenever the author just outright tells you what the character's like. Indirectly is when you have to kind of piece it together for yourself as a reader. Let's go ahead and look at mood now. Mood is very important. Mood is an overall feeling created in the reader by a narrative setting, plot, words, and images. So it's essentially just how the story makes you feel. Tone. Tone is the writer's attitude toward his or her audience and subject. Now, if we look at this photo here, we could definitely pick up on the writer or creator's tone, because we could see how he views his subject. The subject, of course, being Superman. We see this very straight posture. We see him right next to this other person who has a horrible posture. Now we kind of piece this together and start to piece together this idea that the author or writer or creator, however you want to look at it, has a very positive attitude towards the subject, Superman. Now, this again is how we can piece together the tone of a story by looking at what the writer or author or creator thinks about the subject of that story. Then, finally, we have point of view. Point of view is the manner in which a story is narrated or depicted and who it is that tells the story. Simply put, the point of view determines the angle and perception of the story unfolding, and thus influences the tone in which the story takes place. For example, we could have a third-person point of view. We can tell a story about Superman, or we can have a first-person point of view in which Superman tells his own story. So this is where you see words like I pop up. I did this, I said this, as opposed to he did this, he said that. Now we're going to take a look at narrative poetry itself. And narrative poetry tells a story and includes the same literary elements as narrative prose. It has a plot or sequence of events. It has specific settings. And it has characters who participate in the action. Like short stories, narrative poems convey a mood or atmosphere, an overall feeling created by the setting, plot, words, and images. So for example, the setting in this photo here builds a much brighter mood than the setting in this photo here. Finally, the choice of a speaker or narrator affects the tone and mood of the poem. And again, this is getting back to point of view. The speaker's point of view and personality affects how the reader responds to the events and characters being described. Now, this is essentially what makes up the basics of narratives and narrative poetry. Now, from here, we're going to use this as our base to talk about all these different poems and also move on with other narratives that we're going to be reading throughout the rest of the semester. So let's go ahead and wrap this up. Again, you should be finishing up these Cornell notes and moving on to our actual classwork on narrative poetry. That's going to wrap it up for today. Have a good one.